Here we are with Unit 7, commas, and many of these rules you've already seen before as we've gone through this grammar packet, but we'll be really specific on how to use commas and when to use commas, so we're not just throwing them in when we think there's a pause. It is nice to read your writing out loud, and when you pause, add a comma, but for many writers, especially writers who are not native English speakers, that's not always the best case. So it's good to know actually where they go and how they are placed in our sentences. So we have a comma that indicates a pause, and it can separate something, or it can connect two sentences together if it's used with one of our fanboys words. So when to use a comma? Many different ways. Make sure you have your highlighter and highlight what I'm highlighting here because you're going to be going back to this page quite a bit. So you want to use a comma after an opener, an introductory word, phrase, or clause. We have been practicing writing with phrase openers and word openers. An opener is a single word or a fragment that is located at the start of a sentence and is followed by a comma. So they give you some examples here. Notice that here we have an opener that's a transition word, furthermore, comma. Here we have broken and bruised, which is a phrase opener, descriptor, comma. And here we have the dependent clause, which is being used as an opener here, because she had a sore throat. Notice with each of these openers, none of them can stand on their own. Our complete sentence is at the back of each one of these with our subject verb. Jana was, Diaz was, I find. So make sure that that is separated by a comma on each one of those. So that's the first way to use a comma is with a phrase opener. The second way is to use a comma to set off an interrupter, which is a non-essential phrase or clause. And again, we've been practice writing these. It can be a word or a phrase that interrupts the flow of a sentence. You can tell if something's an interrupter by checking to see whether or not it's essential. So what that means is when you have something in the middle with the commas there, if you can take that out completely and the sentence still stands, you know it is an interrupter. The meaning doesn't really change. So here we have William, in fact, made the all-state hockey team. So here we have this nice little insert, right? William, in fact. Again, it makes our writing sound like actual talking. And so that's why we like it. It creates that rhythm that we want, but it is an interrupter, so you have commas on either side of it. Then sometimes we add more information or description. We've talked about this before. Timmy, the smallest of the boys, was teasing my sister. We have our subject here, our verb here. That interrupter I can pull out, but it's giving more description to the thing that comes right before it, Timmy. So we always make sure it's right by the word that it is modifying or right by the word that it is telling more information about. So that's our second rule to set off an interrupter. Our third rule is a closer. Just like we had the opener up here, closer is just what it sounds like. It's at the end. So a closer is a fragment that is added after an independent clause, after the complete sentence, and is preceded by a comma. Joe dribbled up court, his sparkling new Nikes, squeaking with each move he made. That's my closer. It's adding more information. There sat Steve, complete sentence. Steve is blissfully unaware of the chaos he had created. So again, here adding more information, adding the comma. Both of those would not work and not be complete sentences, but we add them to our sentence to add more information. The fourth way to use a comma is to separate items in a series. Students are very good about doing this. I'm sure you are too. When we talk about getting to school on time, first thing, doing my assignment, second thing, behaving well are the third thing. So we list 1, 2, 3 things. That's fine. You're pretty good at that most likely. Number 5 is what we discussed a couple units ago, creating our compound sentences. We use a comma plus one of the fanboys to make a compound sentence. I'd love to help you finish your project, comma, but I have to be at work by 9. We've done this. Gary will turn in his final project, comma, or he will flunk the class. Make sure you have the comma with the fanboys, always. The only time you want to be careful, and I don't think I said this before, is when that second half of your sentence does not have a full subject and full verb, you don't need the comma. So if I said Gary will turn in his final project or will flunk the class, and I drop that I drop that subject, then you drop the comma. You only have the comma if your second half of the sentence is a full complete sentence with a full subject and full verb. If that's not the case, then you take that out. The sixth rule with comma is to introduce a quotation. This is very, very important. When you say, Wait, demanded Steve, you can't leave yet. If you put the the dialogue in and you put the speaker in the middle, you have your quotation marks here of what's actually being said. You put the comma right here inside your quotation marks, inside the quotation marks. Then you put who is speaking, comma, start your new quotation marks, and then your period goes inside the quotation mark. The only way this would be different is if you are citing an author here. Wait, demanded Steve, let's say that's a famous author, right? You can't leave yet. And then I want to put the page number. With MLA citation, I would not put a period there. I would put the page number here. Maybe it's page 83. And then I would put my period there. That's the only kind of caveat, but your teacher should go over MLA formatting with you and be specific about that. Otherwise, the period goes inside the quotation. Maybe you want to start out with who said it. You can say Jerry said, comma, and then open up your quotation marks and period and your quotation marks. So this is very good to use when you're using those dialogues in your narratives, and also when you're quoting outside sources for research type essays. And then we also want to use commas in dates and addresses. Most people do a good job with that. On September 11th, comma, it's after the day, 2011, comma, the United States was attacked. This is the comma that I personally forget, and I think a lot of writers do. So you want to make sure that after whatever date you or address, you always have a comma. It's just a rule, not sure why, just is what it is. So I lived at 13768 Fruit Ridge Avenue, comma, Kent City, comma, Michigan, comma, for 14 years. So do make sure you have the comma before your sentence continues. That is proper punctuation. What happens typically when teachers say we're going to use commas and then they teach all these things, students like throw commas in everywhere. We want to make sure we're not just throwing them in because like, oh, it looked like it needed a comma. We really should know where they belong. So when not to use a comma. Do not use a comma if the dependent clause, those awubis words, come in second in the middle of a sentence. If you have those awubis words in the middle of a sentence, they do not need a comma. Most often what I see students do is comma before because in the middle of the sentence. No, never necessary. I don't care what you've heard before, it's not true. So we don't want to say the boy knocked on the door, comma, while I was eating. We would just say the boy knocked on the door while I was eating. Okay. Also, don't automatically use a comma because you see one of the fanboys words. Oh, this is what I was talking about before. So it's incorrect if you say we sat down the table, comma, and began to talk. No. See how I start with a verb here, but I don't have a subject? You must have a subject in order to have that comma and. So we would just simply take out and say we sat down the table and began to talk. Okay, very important. And then thirdly, you do not need a comma to set off an essential phrase or clause. Remember to ask yourself that question. If you were to take that phrase or clause out of the sentence completely, would the basic meaning of the sentence change? If the answer is yes, then the phrase or clause is essential. So here we have, I recognize many of the students who stood with me in front of the high school. I recognize, again, I practice. I recognize many of the students in front of the high school. You'd be like, what students in front of the high school? The ones who stood with you. This is essential. You need to have it as part, oh, sorry, I messed up there. You need to have this as part of your sentence. So it needs to be there. I moved my comma. Ignore that. We'll just undo. Okay. So those are the three ways you do not need a comma. Go ahead and practice. Go down. This one is hard. If you're like, this is taking me a while and I'm not really sure of what's going on, you're not alone. This is difficult to do. So what it has on this side is it has ways that people use the commas, and here it has the actual rule of why they use the commas. So it's explaining why, which means it's analysis, which means it's harder. So I'll do a few with you here, and I go backwards because, I don't know, test taking strategies. So here, dates and addresses. I look for a date and address. Oh, look, there's one there. Great, that's my A. Use commas to set off interrupters, words, or phrases. I can go up and go, what's an interrupter again? Oh yeah, an interrupter is a thing in the middle with two commas on either side. So then I can go down and go, interrupter, shouted at the teacher. No, he's listing things there. I was walked to famous writer, was born. Yeah, that's an interrupter. Here it's giving more information about the thing before, and I could pull it out and the sentence would still stand. So I would say, yeah, that's B. Then I could use a comma after an opener. So I'm going to look for a phrase, comma. That's not a phrase. That's a complete sentence. That's not a phrase. Whenever I see John. That's a phrase. Whenever I see John, because it has that whenever. So that would be C, opener. And then a closer. We'll do one more. Closer. So I'm going to look at the end, comma, but. No, that's not a closer. That's a coordinating conjunction. An oasis in a desert. Yeah, that is, because that's not a complete sentence. It's just a phrase. It has no verb in it, that's why. So I would say that is D. Okay. Go through, oh, I don't know what I'm doing there, but go through and finish up this, adding all the other information there. And then, of course, check your work. Remember, it's not just important to get the right answer. In fact, this is probably never going to be graded. What's important is that you know this information so that you can use it later in your writing. That's our whole goal. So make sure you're, of course, writing your own sentences and going through and doing all the rest of these. And I'll see you soon with Unit 8.